But okay, if nations are imagined communities, how does that imagining actually happen on a mass scale? What was the engine that allowed millions of people, strangers to each other, to start conceiving of themselves as belonging to the same nation?
Right, how does it become real in people's minds? Anderson argues that the absolutely crucial factor here was print capitalism.
Print capitalism, so the printing press plus the drive for profit.
Exactly. He identifies it as the primary technical and economic factor that made the possibility of imagining the nation a fruitful reality. It allowed people to think about themselves and relate to others in profoundly new ways on a scale never before possible.
Okay, how did print capitalism achieve this transformation?
Primarily through the standardization and popularization of vernacular languages. We touched on this with the decline of Latin. Market forces meant printers found it most profitable to produce books in languages that a wider audience could actually read and understand.
So it wasn't initially some grand ideological project to promote national languages, it was just business.
Pretty much, initially. Printers wanted to sell books, and far more people could read French or English or German than could read Latin. But this purely commercial activity had this profound, largely unintended cultural consequence. It began to fix and standardize vernacular languages.
How did that work?
Well, certain dialects, simply because they happened to be spoken, where major printing presses were set up, or were already widely used in administration or trade, became the basis for what evolved into the standard print languages.
Like the dialect of London becoming the basis for standard English, or Parisian French, or High German gaining dominance over other German dialects.
Precisely. And as these print languages emerged and were codified in dictionaries and grammar books, other dialects that didn't get systematically printed and disseminated started to be seen as substandard, or merely regional variations.
Which explains why, even much later, you see these movements by subnationalities or regional groups fighting to get their own languages recognized, printed, taught. It's about asserting identity in this print-dominated world.
It absolutely is. It's a struggle to establish their own print form, their own legitimacy. And this is different from older administrative vernaculars used by royal courts, which were rarely systematically imposed or standardized across entire subject populations in the same way print languages were.
Okay, so print languages created these new, larger communities of readers defined by the specific vernacular they shared. But how did just reading the same books or newspapers create a sense of community among people who never met, who were complete strangers?
This is where the newspaper in particular becomes such a crucial cultural form for imagining the nation. Early newspapers, they weren't always filled with high politics or grand national narratives. Often they were quite mundane.
Like what? Shipping news? Market prices?
Exactly. Lists of ship arrivals, commodity prices in different ports, announcements of political appointments, local marriages, crime reports, advertisements. Anderson calls them often just appendages of the market.
Just practical information for people involved in trade or local affairs.
But here's the genius insight. By simply placing all these disparate items, a ship arriving from Cadiz, the price of sugar, a local wedding, a new bishop side by side on the same page, the newspaper created an implicit imagined community among its readers.
How so?
Because all these seemingly random items were relevant to a specific group of people, those who shared that particular administrative territory, like a colony or a province, participated in that specific market system, were interested in that social sphere. Reading the paper connected you to that shared world.
So reading the newspaper wasn't just about getting information. It was an act of participating in a shared reality with thousands of other unseen readers.
Precisely. And Anderson highlights the ritualistic aspect of it, calling it a kind of mass ceremony. Reading the newspaper is typically done in silent privacy, maybe over breakfast, right?
Yeah.
But the reader is profoundly aware that thousands, maybe millions of other people they will never, ever know are performing the exact same ritual, the exact same time, consuming the exact same information.
I'm reading this now, and countless other Frenchmen or Virginians or whoever are reading this now too. We're sharing this simultaneous experience, even though we're alone.
And you're confident of the existence of these anonymous others, even though you have no idea who they are individually. This repeated, simultaneous private ceremony happening daily or weekly across a defined geographical area provides this powerful, concrete image, a figure for a secular, historically clocked, imagined community based on anonymity. It's the total opposite of the personal, face-to-face hierarchical ties of the old dynastic world.
That's a really compelling image. And you mentioned something about the novelistic format of the newspaper helping this.
Yes. Like a novel, the newspaper presents a cast of characters and entities. Think cities, companies, political figures, even whole countries or regions. These entities move through that homogeneous empty time we talked about.
Okay.
So when, say, the country of Mali disappears from the headlines for a week, the reader doesn't assume Mali has ceased to exist. They just assume it's still out there, moving along in that same clock time, simply not currently featuring in the narrative, in the plot.
Right. It's still chugging along meanwhile.
Exactly. This structure links the simultaneous consumption of information to a sense of ongoing shared experience within a defined, bounded world, the world covered by that newspaper, which very often corresponded to the boundaries of an emerging nation or colony.
It reinforces the idea that this collection of people and events within these borders constitutes a cohesive thing, moving together through time.
And this print-mediated world created a very different kind of social cohesion than the old aristocratic kind. Aristocratic cohesion, it was based on concrete things: kinship, marriage alliances, patron-client relationships, personal loyalties.
Knowing people face to face or knowing who they were connected to.
Right. They could function as a class, even if many of them were illiterate, because their connections were personal and tangible. But the bourgeoisie, the emerging middle class, they were geographically dispersed, largely anonymous to one another. They came into being as a self-conscious class, partly through this process of replication via print. Meaning, a factory owner in Lille knew that other factory owners like him existed in Lyon. Not necessarily because he'd met them, but because he could visualize their existence, their shared interests, their shared world, through reading newspapers, trade journals, novels. Print allowed for the imagining of horizontal connections and shared identity between strangers based on shared information and that shared experience of time and space defined by print.
It sounds like print capitalism really provided both the common linguistic medium and the shared temporal framework. That experience of simultaneity within a defined sphere, making the abstract idea of nation feel concrete and real to millions of people for the first time.
It absolutely was the engine. It took that cultural possibility created by the decline of the old certainties and turned it into a widespread lived reality.
Okay, so the stage is set. The old ways of understanding the world are fading. Print capitalism is providing this new engine for imagining community. Where do we first see this process really take shape on a large scale? Where do the first nationalisms emerge?
Anderson points very clearly to the first major wave being the Creole nationalisms in the Americas. These started emerging in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Creole nationalisms in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies.
Exactly. These movements happened largely within the existing administrative units of those empires, the viceroyalties, the captaincies general.
And just to remind ourselves, Creoles were people of European descent, but born in the colonies, right?
That's right. And they occupied this really peculiar sort of in-between position. On the one hand, they were a colonial community, sharing language, religion, cultural values with the metropole, with Spain or Portugal. On the other hand, they were also typically the local upper class, controlling land, mines, commerce, labor. But politically and economically, they were subordinate to the empire. They were expected to send wealth back to Europe, and the top jobs in the colonial administration were usually reserved for people sent directly from Spain or Portugal, the peninsulares.
So they had deep ties to Europe, but also a growing distinct identity tied to the specific American territory where they lived and held power locally.
And a really crucial factor, Anderson argues, spurring their eventual push for independence was often a profound fear. Fear of political mobilization by the lower classes.
Lower classes, meaning?
Meaning the vast indigenous populations or the enslaved Africans. Rebellions like Tupac Amaru's massive indigenous uprising in Peru in the 1780s, or even more terrifyingly for elites, to Salvatier's successful slave revolt that created Haiti in the 1790s. These sent absolute shockwaves of fear through Creole elites all across the Americas.
They worried about losing control from below.
Deeply. And this fear got much worse when the metropolitan powers seemed weak or distracted, for example, when Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal. Suddenly, that military protection from Europe seemed less reliable.
That's a really fascinating and maybe slightly uncomfortable angle, that the desire to maintain control over local populations, to prevent social revolution from below, could actually push elites to break away from the distant imperial power that might theoretically intervene.
It certainly complicates any simple narrative of purely idealistic national liberation, doesn't it? We see this fear reflected elsewhere, too. Think about the resistance of Creole planters, people like Thomas Jefferson and other wealthy Virginian slaveholders, to attempts by London to maybe restrain the slave trade or implement slightly more humane slave laws.
They didn't want any interference.
They prioritized their economic interests and, crucially, their control over the enslaved population. They feared any external intervention that might empower those they held in bondage. This desire for local control over labor, over society, free from metropolitan meddling, was a powerful, often unspoken driver towards political autonomy.
So alongside these fears and economic interests, how did a sense of shared national identity tied to these specific territories like Venezuela or Mexico develop among these Creoles?
Anderson highlights the really interesting role of what he calls administrative journeys. He draws on the anthropologist Victor Turner, who wrote about how journeys themselves can create meaning and community.
Okay, how did that apply here?
Well, careers in the colonial bureaucracy for these Creole officials often involved a lot of travel. But crucially, travel within the boundaries of their specific administrative unit. A functionary might get posted from the capital, say Lima, out to a provincial town like Cusco, then maybe later to Trujillo, looping around within the viceroyalty of Peru.
So their whole career path, their physical movement was confined to that specific colonial box.
Pretty much. This was different from, say, older feudal journeys, where an heir might travel to the king's court far away for investiture and then return straight back to their ancestral land, a round trip to a fixed center. The new bureaucratic journey was more about charting a course within a defined administrative space. Your progress wasn't tied to inherited land, but maybe to talent, connections, administrative need. You were aiming for a summit in the colonial hierarchy, not relating to a single cosmic center.
And these looping journeys created connections.
They created shared experiences and recognition among Creole functionaries from different towns and regions within that specific unit. They saw the diversity of the territory firsthand. They met colleagues from different places. They dealt with the same regulations, the same superiors. They developed a practical, lived understanding of the administrative unit's geography, its people, its problems.
It gave them a concrete physical sense of the boundaries and the content of that specific colonial territory, what it meant to be in Peru or in New Granada.
Yes, and you combine this shared experience within the administrative boundary with their shared language and culture inherited from the metropole and their shared political exclusion from the very top jobs, being permanently subordinated to those peninsulars sent from Spain, officials who often lacked the deep local roots and wealth of the Creole magnates.
Right, the resentment factor.
Exactly. That combination fostered a powerful sense of shared grievance and shared identity within that unit. The peninsulares were often seen as outsiders, homines novi, dependent purely on the crown, creating friction with the locally powerful Creole elites.
So the lines the empire drew on the map just for administrative convenience started to feel like the natural boundaries of their own potential nation, their own fatherland.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
The administrative unit, given concrete shape by these shared journeys, by print media circulating within its borders, combined with the shared culture, language, and the shared experience of exclusion. It led to the imagining of these specific territories as potential fatherlands.
And the result was?
The result was the political viability of entities like Chile, Venezuela, Mexico administrative units becoming independent nations. You even see conscious acts of nation building like Simon Bolivar or San Martin decreeing that certain indigenous inhabitants were now Peruvians or Colombians, trying to forge a new national identity based on that territorial unit.
And the fact that these often wealthy, comfortable Creole classes were willing to risk everything, their lives, their fortunes, for this cause, it really speaks to the power of the emotional attachment they must have felt to this newly imagined community.
It suggests something much deeper than just cold economic calculation was at play. And it's also telling, as you mentioned, that they largely didn't try to recreate the old dynastic principle. They formed republics based on this new idea of a popular national community. Brazil's the main exception, but that had very unique circumstances with the Portuguese royal family actually relocating there.
It really underscores that a fundamental shift in how political community itself was conceived had taken place. The age of nations had begun.
Absolutely. That was the first big wave.
So that's the first wave, often driven by these Creole elites operating within existing imperial structures. What about later waves of nationalism, especially in the later 19th and early 20th centuries? Did it look different?
Yes. This is where Anderson discusses what he terms official nationalism. This often emerged as a more top-down reactive policy. It was frequently adopted by threatened dynastic realms or established ruling groups like old empires or monarchies, specifically in response to the rise of those popular vernacular-based nationalisms bubbling up from below, which were challenging their legitimacy and threatening to break up their multi-ethnic domains.
So the old empire is trying to steal the thunder of nationalism, trying to use its tools to preserve themselves, fighting fire with fire.
That's a great way to put it. Official nationalism is described as a deliberate weld, an attempt to fuse the new, powerful principle of the nation with the old principle of the dynasty. The state, often led by the monarchy or the existing ruling elite, actively tries to foster a sense of national identity, but one that is specifically loyal to and centered around the existing dynastic or state structure. It's nationalism directed from above, rather than emerging organically from below.
Okay, can you give some examples of this official nationalism in action?
A classic case is the Russian Empire under Tsar Alexander III in the late 19th century. He implemented these aggressive policies of Russification.
Right, forcing the Russian language and culture on non-Russian peoples.
Yes, but it wasn't just about cultural uniformity. It was fundamentally a dynastic policy aimed at strengthening the Tsar's autocratic rule. It was a reaction against internal unrest and the emerging national movements among the empire's many non-Russian populations. Poles, Finns, Ukrainians, and so on.
So how did it work?
It strategically mobilized great Russian nationalism behind the throne. Promoting the Russian language, Russian culture, the Russian Orthodox Church became synonymous with loyalty to the Tsar. And importantly, it also offered tangible opportunities and advantages for ethnic Russian functionaries, entrepreneurs, and settlers within the vast imperial bureaucracy and the expanding Russian market across the empire.
So identifying as Russian became politically advantageous and tied directly to loyalty to the Tsar and the imperial project.
Precisely. Another prime example is the British Empire. Just look at Queen Victoria's evolving title, Queen of England, but later also Empress of India. That title itself perfectly emblematizes this weld between the national identity of the metropole, England, Britain, and the vast, diverse imperial domain.
Connecting the crown to the empire.
And think about policies like Macaulayism in India, which started back in the 1830s. Thomas Macaulay famously advocated for creating a class of Indian intermediaries who would be Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect.
Wow, that's a very explicit project of cultural engineering.
It absolutely was a conscious, long-range project to shape a cultural identity within the colonized elite that was aligned with the imperial center. The aim was to foster loyalty, facilitate administration, make the empire run smoother, even while, of course, maintaining rigid racial hierarchies and barriers.
That idea of making people English encased and intellect, while they remain marked by their irremediable color blood, as the source puts it, that really highlights the inherent contradiction, doesn't it?
It does. Anderson calls it a form of mental miscegenation that was pursued with a kind of naive optimism, especially compared to earlier, perhaps cruder ideas about physical intermingling. He even notes a sort of progress in dankiness in this approach.
Mental miscegenation.
And this official nationalism, this imperial project, also created vast new opportunities for the burgeoning middle classes back in the metropole Britain in this case. Functionaries, administrators, soldiers, schoolmasters, merchants, they could fan out across the empire, staffing this system, disseminating this official culture, building careers.
Right. What was a key difference, though, between an empire like the Russian one, which was mostly a continuous landmass, and the British Empire, which was scattered all over the globe in terms of how this official nationalism played out?
The physical geography mattered, certainly. In the vast, continuous Russian landmass, travel was hard. Internal barriers could be significant. But the domain felt geographically unified in a way the scattered British Empire didn't. But crucially, Anderson argues that the experience of the colonial elites within this system of official nationalism, even in the far-flung British colonies, ended up having very similar nation-generating consequences to the earlier Creole experience in the Americas.
Really? Even though the context was different later time period, different empires, how so?
To think about, for example, members of the highly educated Indian Civil Service, ICS, or similar colonial services in other British territories, like Burma or Ceylon or in Africa. These were often people educated in England, rigorously trained in British administrative methods, culturally assimilated in many ways, fluent in English, deeply familiar with British culture.
The products of Macaulayism, perhaps?
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Yet, despite all this training and assimilation, they consistently faced what Anderson terms irrational permanent subordination. They hit a glass ceiling. meaning they were typically barred from reaching the very highest positions in the colonial administration within their own homeland. Those top jobs, the governorships, the key central roles, were almost always reserved for Britons sent out from the metropole. And furthermore, their career paths were often restricted. They couldn't easily transfer laterally to another colony or vertically back to a high-level position in London in the way their British colleagues could.
So they were highly educated, culturally British in many ways, but ultimately blocked from full participation and advancement purely because of their origin or race.
Exactly. They were condemned to serve within the confines of British India, or British Burma, or British Malaya. They became, in a sense, strangers in their native land, somewhat estranged from their own people by their Western education and role in the colonial structure, but simultaneously excluded from full membership and acceptance in the colonizer's world.
That sounds like a recipe for resentment and a search for a different identity.
Precisely. And how did this lead to national imagining within the colony? Because their administrative journeys, their entire careers, were confined to looping within the boundaries of their particular colonial territory.
Just like the Creoles.
Just like the Creoles. An Indian ICS officer might serve in Calcutta, then be posted to Lucknow, then perhaps Madras, all within the vast territory defined as British India. A Burmese official might serve in Rangoon, then Mandalay, then Vassain, all within British Burma.
So they experienced the territory as a single unit through their work.
Yes, and this created a sense of communality, shared experience, and shared frustration with other bilingual, educated elites, whether they were Burman, Karen, Indian, or Chinese, who were also confined to and working within that specific territory's administration and social sphere. They shared the experience of navigating the particular bureaucracy of Burma or of India.
So the colonial state, just by drawing lines on a map and setting up these administrative structures with their built-in ceilings for locals, inadvertently fostered a shared identity within the boundaries of that colony. It basically handed the future nationalists the template for their nation.
It's a powerful example of how the structures of empire, designed purely to maintain control and extract resources, could unintentionally create the very conditions for national consciousness among the colonized elite. The colonial state itself became the framework for the future national state.
Any other examples of this official reactive nationalism?
The Hungarian example within the Habsburg Empire is another clear case. The Magyar gentry, feeling squeezed between the German-speaking Habsburg center and the demands of minority groups within Hungary, Slovaks, Romanians, etc., pushed hard for Magyarization, imposing the Hungarian language. But this was explicitly linked to protecting their own class interests and dominance. They used linguistic nationalism to consolidate their power, but deliberately excluded minorities and the working class from real political participation. It shows again how this official nationalism can be deeply tied to the defensive reaction of established elites trying to maintain their position.
So in both the earlier Creole cases and these later colonial contexts, the administrative units drawn by empires and the career paths forced upon local elites within those units played this crucial, if often unintended, role in defining the physical and social shape of the future nation.
Absolutely. Which brings us directly to the specific tools the state used, especially the colonial state, to imagine, solidify, and manage its dominion. These tools, transformed by the age of mechanical reproduction, things like mass printing, photography, standardized surveying, became powerful instruments. Institutions like the census, the map, and the museum allowed the state to conceive of and structure the people and territory it ruled in new ways.
And these tools didn't just help the state manage things, they actively shaped how people, including those who would later resist the state, came to imagine their own community.
Profoundly so. These tools shaped how the state saw its domain, how it presented that domain, and ultimately laid the groundwork for national identity forming within those state-defined boundaries.
Okay, let's break those down. First, the census. How did counting people become a tool of state imagination?
The census wasn't just about numbers. It created what Anderson calls a totalizing classificatory grid, a kind of abstract map imposed onto the entire population by the secular state.
A grid based on?
Based on categories the state decided were important.
Yeah.
Race, tribe, caste, language, religion, occupation. Everyone had to fit into one of the boxes. And this grid often clashed violently with how people actually lived and identified themselves with older, more fluid, overlapping, or self-chosen forms of community an identity.
Like someone who might identify primarily with their religious group or their clan or maybe multiple identities, but the census forces them into a single ethnic or racial box.
Exactly, and the state often actively manipulated these categories, especially trying to align census identities with existing communities, particularly religious ones, by sort of ethnicizing them.
Ethnicizing religion, what do you mean?
For instance, in British Malaya, the census often treated Islamic as basically synonymous with Malay, forcing a religious identity into an ethnic racial category, ignoring Malay Christians or Muslim Indians. In the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch fostered distinct ethnic Christianities. You weren't just Christian, you were an Ambonese Christian or a Batak Christian, fitting people into the colonial ethno-religious grid.
So this wasn't just neutral administration, it was actively imposing a state-defined structure onto a complex social reality, making the population legible and controllable according to the state's logic.
Absolutely. It was about creating quantifiable, manageable units.
And were there parts of society that managed to resist this, that didn't fit neatly onto the grid?
Oh, yes. Anderson points out that things like religious shrines, traditional schools like Islamic peasantry, religious courts, places often based on voluntary affiliation and community self-definition rather than state classification, often existed outside or adjacent to the state's neat topographical grid. They were topographically anomalous to the state's way of seeing.
They didn't show up properly on the state's map of identities.
Exactly. And because they weren't easily categorized, counted, or controlled by the state's instruments, they often became zones of relative freedom. And significantly, they frequently became crucial centers, even fortresses, for anti-colonial movements and the preservation of alternative identities.
That's a powerful image, the very places the state couldn't easily map or count becoming these pockets of resistance.
Okay, what about the map itself? How did maps function as tools of imagination?